Some roads lead somewhere ordinary. This one didn't. She had seen grief before. She knew what a house looks like when someone stops caring for it.
He hadn't let anyone in. Not once. Not in 2 years.
She stopped at the bottom of the steps. So did he, Cal, in every way that mattered.
She said 3 words. He hadn't heard his own name spoken like that in a very long time.
The tradition had a shape to it, like most things in Milhaven did. It moved in a quiet rotation, passed from hand to hand the way a hymnal gets passed down a church pew, without ceremony, without instruction, simply understood. When a man broke his leg, a dish appeared on his porch. When a woman delivered a baby in the hard hours before dawn, a pot of soup materialized on her stove before the sun was fully up. When death came, as it always did to the small houses and the large ones alike, the food came with it. Not to fill the hole, nothing could fill the hole, but to say plainly and without words that someone had noticed. That someone had taken the time to stand at a stove and stir, to press a crust with their fingers, to carry something warm across the miles and set it down. The tradition was older than anyone in Milhaven could remember. It had no name. It needed none. Nora Callaway had been part of it for 9 years. She was 31 years old in the summer of 1883, and she had lived alone in her small clapboard house on the eastern edge of town since she was 22. Since the spring that Clem Callaway had gone to bed with a cough and never gotten up again. The fever had taken him in 11 days. She remembered counting them. 11 days between the man who used to whistle while he mended tack and the silence that replaced him, a silence so complete it had a texture like wet wool pressing against her chest. On the 3rd day after the burial, 3 women had appeared at her door. She had not known them well then. She had only been in Milhaven for 2 years, a young bride still learning the names of the neighbors, still learning which roads turned to mud in the spring thaw and which ones held. But those 3 women, Mrs. Vance among them, had stood on her porch in the gray morning light with covered dishes in their arms and expressions on their faces that asked nothing of her. No explanations, no performances of grief. They had simply handed her the dishes, pressed her hands briefly and left. One had brought a pot of chicken and dumplings. One had brought a loaf of dark bread still warm from the oven. One had brought an apple cake that smelled of cinnamon and brown sugar, a smell so ordinary and so human that Nora had stood in her doorway for a long time after they left, just breathing it in. She had not been able to explain, then or after, what that moment had meant. It was not the food, though she had eaten it and been grateful. It was the fact of it. The fact that 3 women had woken that morning and thought of her. That they had chosen, out of all the things a morning could demand, to spend their hours in the making of something warm and carry it to her door. It was a language she had not known existed until she needed it, and then she had understood it completely. In the 9 years since, she had become one of its most careful speakers. She knew the rotation the way a musician knows a piece of music, not by reading it, but by feel, by instinct, by the memory in her hands. She knew which families needed a light touch and which needed a full pot. She knew that old Harlan Dewey, who had lost his wife 3 winters back, would not answer the door but would take the food if she left it on the step and walked away without looking back. She knew that the Finch children, when their mother was ill, wanted corn muffins specifically because their mother made corn muffins, and the shape of the thing mattered as much as the taste. She had learned all of this not from being told but from paying attention, and paying attention was the thing she did best. She ran her small homestead with a quiet competence that the town had come to rely on without quite noticing it. Her garden was the most productive on the east side of Milhaven. Her chickens were healthy. Her fences were sound. She could mend a shirt so the seam was invisible, and she could look at a sick animal and tell you, more often than not, whether it would recover. She had built this life one careful, deliberate day at a time, and she was proud of it, though pride was not a word she would have used. She would have said capable. She would have said managed. She would not have said lonely, though that word lived somewhere in her also, in the quiet of the evenings when the chores were done, and the house had no sound in it but the settling of wood. It was on a Tuesday morning in late June that Mrs. Bertie Vance, wife of Pastor Vance and keeper of the rotation list, sat across from Nora at the small table in the church office and laid a piece of paper between them. The list was short this month. Nora's eyes moved down it quickly. The alderman boy, 16 and reckless, had broken his collarbone coming off a horse he had no business riding. The new school teacher, a young woman from back east who had come to Milhaven full of ambition and promptly caught a summer cold that had settled into something more serious, was on the mend but still confined to her boarding house room. 2 names, straightforward, manageable, and then at the bottom in Mrs. Vance's careful, slightly hesitant handwriting, a 3rd name, Wade Garrett. Nora looked at it for a moment, then she looked up. Mrs. Vance was studying the grain of the table. The name sat in the air of the small office the way a stone sits in still water, not making waves exactly, but changing the surface of everything around it. Nora was aware of a particular quality of silence that had entered the room, the kind that has weight. Wade Garrett. She knew the name the way everyone in Milhaven knew it, the way you know a weather pattern or a road condition, as a fact of the local landscape that you navigate around without thinking too much about why. He had come to Milhaven 8 years ago with his wife Ruth, a fair-haired woman of quiet warmth and considerable good sense, and they had built up the Garrett ranch on the western edge of the valley with a steadiness that the town had respected. Wade was not a man given to speeches or saloons. He showed up when he said he would. He paid what he owed. He worked from first light until the light was gone, and when the work was done, he went home to his wife, and that, by all appearances, was exactly where he wanted to be. Ruth Garrett had died in the spring of 1881. A sickness that had started as a winter cough and had proven, over the following months, to be something that medicine could not reach. Nora had not known Ruth well. Their paths had not crossed often, their homesteads on opposite edges of town. But she remembered seeing her at church in those last months, the way her face had taken on a particular transparent quality, as though the light was passing through her rather than reflecting off her. She remembered the way Wade used to sit beside her, slightly closer than necessary, his large hand resting on the pew between them where she could reach it if she wanted to. After Ruth died, the rotation had gone to the Garrett ranch as a matter of course. Dishes had made the 5-mile journey west, carried by various women of the congregation. For the first few weeks they had been received, or so it was reported, though Wade himself had not come to the door. By midsummer, the dishes had begun coming back. Returned to the church porch, sometimes untouched, sometimes with the food still inside, beginning to spoil. Once a full pot of beef stew that someone had labored over for hours had been left on the front step of the church with a small note that said only, "Thank you," in handwriting that did not look like a man who had slept. After that, the rotation had quietly, without discussion, ceased to include the Garrett name. 2 years had passed. Wade Garrett had become a fixture of a particular Milhaven variety, present enough to be seen, absent enough to be a subject of concern, and sufficiently private to make that concern uncomfortable to voice. He appeared at the general store on occasion. He was seen sometimes on the road, riding alone, his face carrying an expression that discouraged inquiry. He had let his ranch hand go the previous fall, which meant he was working the place alone. And what that place looked like after 2 years of a single grieving man's attention was a matter of some speculation. No one had gone out there in a year. The pastor, Mrs. Vance, said finally, without looking up, felt it was time to try again. Nora looked at the name on the list. She thought about what she knew of that particular silence, the one that lived in a house after the person who made it a home was gone. She knew its weight. She knew the way it pressed. She knew how a man could sit inside it for so long that it started to feel like the truth of things rather than a temporary condition. She thought about the pot of soup returned to the church steps with a note in sleepless handwriting. "I'll take Thursday," she said. Her voice was even. "Mrs. Vance looked up then, and the expression on her face was complicated, relief and unease in roughly equal measure. She nodded once and wrote Nora's name beside Wade Garrett's on the list, and neither of them said anything more about it. Thursday arrived with a sky the color of bleached linen, high and flat and offering nothing in the way of comfort. Nora was up before the light, which was not unusual for her. She built up the fire and stood in her kitchen in the particular quiet of early morning, the kind of quiet that feels provisional, like the world is still deciding what kind of day it intends to be. She made a beef stew, thick, with good potatoes from her garden and the last of the spring carrots, and a handful of dried herbs that she kept in small labeled jars above the stove. She made it the way she made everything, with attention, without waste, with a steady focus on the task in front of her rather than the task behind. She baked a pan of cornbread. She put up a jar of her peach preserves, the good ones, the ones she'd made in August when the peaches were at their peak and the kitchen had smelled like summer distilled into something you could hold in your hands. She did not allow herself to think too carefully about where she was going or why. She had learned in 9 years of this work that thinking too carefully about it was the wrong approach. The point was not to understand the grief. The point was to show up in the presence of it, with something warm, and let that be enough. She packed the basket and hitched her mare and set out west on the Milhaven road as the sun cleared the ridge. The road ran through good country, flat-bottomed valley giving way to rolling grassland, the hills to the north still holding the blue shadows of early morning. In another hour the day would be hot, but now the air was clean and carried the smell of sage and dry grass, and the faint metallic scent of a sky that might eventually consider rain. Nora rode with the easy posture of a woman who had spent her life in a saddle, her hands light on the reins, her eyes on the road ahead. She had made this kind of ride before, to the Hennessy place after old Tom Hennessy's heart had given out, to the Briggs farm when their youngest had the scarlet fever, to the small house at the edge of the cottonwood grove where Widow Ames lived alone with her 3 cats and her grief over a son who had gone to Colorado and not come back. She knew the particular shape of a road that leads to someone else's sorrow. She knew how the last quarter mile felt, the slight slowing of the horse, the adjustment of your own breathing, the quiet gathering of whatever you had to offer. But as the Garrett ranch came into view over the last gentle rise, she felt something she did not usually feel on these rides. A hesitation, not fear exactly, something more like recognition. The place looked the way the rumors felt. The house was a good-sized structure, solidly built, the kind of house a man puts up when he intends to stay and intends to prosper. But prosperity had retreated from it, and what was left was the skeleton of intention. The porch railing on the south side hung at an angle, one end detached from its post, drooping with the resigned look of something that had been waiting a long time for attention it was not going to get. The path from the gate to the front steps was deep in weeds, not the casual weeds of a busy man who hadn't gotten around to it, but the established weeds of a place where no one had walked that path in a deliberate way for a long time. The paint on the house had gone past peeling into something more serious, great gray patches of exposed wood that gave the building a weathered, exhausted expression. The barn, at least, looked functional. The fences of the near pasture were standing. The cattle in the far field were from a distance in reasonable condition. The man had kept the animals alive. He had kept the essential machinery of the ranch operating, but he had let everything else go, everything that was not strictly necessary to the survival of the livestock, and what remained was a place that looked like it had forgotten what it was for. He was on the porch. She had half expected to find the place empty, to have to leave the basket and ride back without encountering him at all. But there he was, in a straight-backed wooden chair at the far end of the porch, his long legs extended in front of him, his gaze fixed on something in the middle distance that had nothing to do with the road or the approaching rider or anything else in the visible world. She remembered Wade Garrett from before. She had seen him at church, at the occasional town gathering, across the yard at the feed store. She remembered him as a man of considerable physical presence, not loud, not showy, but solid in a way that went beyond the merely physical, a man who occupied his space in the world with an easy certainty that came from knowing what he was about. She remembered him smiling at something Ruth said once, after the Sunday service, a smile that started in his eyes before it reached his mouth, the kind of smile a man gives when he is not performing happiness but simply feeling it. That man in this one shared a face and a frame, but not much else. He was thinner than she remembered, not dramatically so, but enough to change the character of his silhouette. The solid breadth of shoulder still there, but without the fullness of a man who had been eating properly and sleeping enough. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were rough and chapped in a way that spoke of work performed without the small courtesies of care. His face, under several days of beard growth, was the face of a man who had been somewhere very far away for a very long time, and was not entirely sure he had made it all the way back. He watched her come up the road. He watched her turn through the gate. He watched her tie her horse to the post and take the basket from the saddlebag. He did all of this watching without any change in his expression whatsoever, which was the expression of a man who had run out of reaction some time ago and had not yet found cause to develop new ones. Nora walked to the bottom of the porch steps and stopped. She had stood at enough thresholds in her life to know that this one required care. "Mr. Garrett," she said. Her voice was what it always was in these moments, quiet, direct, carrying no more weight than the words themselves required. "I brought you some supper." He looked at the basket. He looked at her. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray blue, the color of the sky on a day when the weather cannot make up its mind. They were eyes that had once, she thought, been capable of considerable expressiveness, and were now practicing a different discipline entirely. He gave a slow, single nod. It was not enthusiasm. It was not welcome. But it was not dismissal either. And Nora had learned, over 9 years of this work, to recognize the difference between a door that is closed and a door that is merely very heavy. She climbed the steps. The porch held one chair, the one he was in, and a small table beside it that was thick with dust, and held a coffee cup that had been sitting there long enough that the residue inside had gone from liquid to something more permanent. She set the basket on the edge of the railing and began to take out the things she had brought. The pot of stew, still warm from the ride inside its wrapping, the cornbread, the jar of preserves. She had brought 2 plates. She had brought 2 forks. She had not made a decision about this, exactly. It had simply been the way her hands had packed the basket that morning, and she had not examined the impulse closely enough to question it. She was setting the second plate down when she became aware that he had moved. It was a small movement, almost involuntary, the way a man moves when an old habit stirs before his conscious mind has approved the motion. He had reached inside the front door, which stood slightly open the way the doors of solitary people often do in summer, not quite open, not quite closed, and he had brought out a second chair. It was a simple ladder-back chair, its rungs worn smooth with use, and he set it down on the porch a few feet from his own with a scrape of wood against wood that sounded very loud in the quiet of the afternoon. He did not look at her. He did not say, "Sit down." He set the chair in the space and left it there, and returned to his own and resumed his contemplation of the middle distance, and Nora understood that he had not invited her to sit so much as he had created the structural possibility of it, and that whatever happened next was entirely her choice. She stood for a moment at the threshold of that choice. She thought of 3 women on her own porch in the gray morning of grief 9 years ago. She thought of the way they had not pressed. She thought of the way they had simply offered the shape of a thing and let her decide what to do with it. She untied her bonnet and set it on the railing. She sat down. The wood of the chair was warm from the afternoon sun. The porch faced west, and the light at this hour was the particular gold of late afternoon in the Wyoming summer, thick and horizontal, and making everything it touched look like something worth looking at, even the weedy path. Even the tired paint, even the man in the chair beside her who had not spoken and did not appear to be planning to, staring out at the grassland with those pale, distant eyes. Nora served the stew into the 2 plates she had brought and set one on the arm of his chair without comment. She cut the cornbread and put a piece beside it. She did not fuss over it. She simply served it the way she would serve a meal in her own kitchen, without ceremony, without the performance of generosity. He looked at the plate. For a long moment he did not move, and Nora thought perhaps she had miscalculated, that the gesture of the chair notwithstanding, he was going to leave the food where she had put it and they were going to sit here in silence until she felt enough time had passed to take her leave with dignity. Then he picked up the fork. He ate the way a man eats when he has been surviving on what is strictly necessary for a long time, and his body recognizes, before his pride does, that this is something different. He ate slowly at first, then with more focus, and when the plate was empty he did not ask for more, but he did not look away from it quickly either. Nora ate her own portion and watched the light change over the valley. She had been right about the silence. It was a heavy one, dense with the accumulated weight of 2 years of no one sitting in that second chair. But it was not hostile. It was not the silence of a man who wanted her gone. It was, she thought, the silence of a man who had simply forgotten, or perhaps never quite known, how to exist in the presence of another person without his wife there to serve as the bridge between himself and the world. When the food was done, she gathered the plates and put the pot back in the basket. She left the cornbread and the preserves on the table. "I'll be back for the dish," she said. She kept her voice the same as before, light, matter-of-fact, not making anything out of it. He nodded. That same slow, minimal movement. She picked up her basket. She picked up her bonnet. She had tied it back on and started down the steps when she stopped, reached back into the basket and took out a small mason jar. In it, because she had not examined the impulse closely enough to stop it, she had placed a handful of wildflowers from along the fence line of her own property. Indian paintbrush, a few stems of blue flax, a spray of the yellow clover that had been coming in strong along the east meadow. She set the jar on the dusty table beside where the food had been, next to the ring left by his coffee cup. She did not look at him when she did it. She went down the steps and untied her horse and mounted up, and as she turned the mare toward the road, she allowed herself one brief glance back. He was looking at the jar of flowers, not at her, not at the horizon, at the small jar of wildflowers she had left on his table, with an expression that she could not quite read from this distance, but that did not look like nothing. She rode east toward Milhaven, and she did not try to name what she felt on the way home. The following Thursday she went back. She had not been asked. It was not her week on the rotation. She had given up her Thursday to Cora Alderman for the rest of the month, in an arrangement that made sense logistically. She had no particular reason to make the 5-mile ride west, except that she had woken Thursday morning and packed a basket before she had given herself enough time to decide whether or not she was going to. She brought a roasted chicken this time, potatoes, herbed, a jar of bread and butter pickles she had put up last fall. And from her garden, because her hands had done it again without consulting her mind, a fresh cutting of wildflowers, different ones this time, the purple clover that had come in along the south fence, and some of the white yarrow that grew at the edge of the kitchen garden. She told herself it was because the first jar had probably died by now, and there was no reason to leave a jar of dead flowers on a man's table. She told herself it was because throwing them away when there were plenty along the fence line would be wasteful. She told herself, as her mare covered the road west with a steady rhythm, that this was no different from any other stop on any other week, that Wade Garrett was a name on a list that had been neglected for too long, and that consistency was part of what made the tradition work. She was careful enough at this kind of self-negotiation that she almost believed herself. He was on the porch. She had wondered if she would find the place empty, or find him unresponsive, or find that the gesture of the previous Thursday had been a single anomaly and not a pattern. But he was in his chair, in the same position as before, except that 2 things were different. The porch had been swept. And on the small table, in the space between the 2 chairs, there were 2 tin cups, both of them holding water, both of them beaded with condensation on the outside, because they had been brought out recently in the last little while, and the afternoon was warm. He had been waiting for her. Nora looked at the cups for a moment before she climbed the steps. She sat in the second chair. She served the food. He ate with the same methodical focus as before, finishing everything, his gaze for the most part on the middle distance. But this time, roughly a third of the way through the meal, he spoke. "Road give you any trouble coming out?" he asked. His voice was low and unpolished, the voice of a man who had not used it much lately, rough at the edges in the way of a tool that needs some working in. Nora considered the question. It was a small question, a practical question, the kind of question men in this part of Wyoming asked when they wanted to say something and had not yet found the right category for it. Little soft in the low crossing, she said, but nothing the mayor couldn't handle. He nodded. We could use the rain, he said. We could, she agreed. And that was the whole of it, those 4 sentences, but they sat differently than the silence had. They had changed the texture of the air on the porch, introduced something into it that had not been there before, something small and uncertain and not nothing. Before she left, she put the new jar of flowers on the table. She did not comment on it. She simply set it down in the same spot as the last one. The first jar was still there. The flowers in it were dead and dry, the stems having turned transparent in the way of cut flowers past their time. But he had not thrown it away. He had left it on the table where she had put it, and there it still was. Nora registered this without comment and rode home in the slanted light of the late afternoon. A rhythm began. Every Thursday she rode west. Every Thursday he was on the porch, the steps swept, the 2 cups of water waiting on the table between the chairs. She was not sure when the sweeping of the porch had started. It might have been the 2nd week, or it might have been the 3rd, but by the 4th Thursday the step itself had been fixed. The soft wood of the 2nd tread replaced with new pine, pale and clean against the weathered gray of the rest of it. The conversation grew in the way a fire grows when you feed it carefully and do not rush it. A few sentences the 2nd week. A question from him the 3rd week about her chickens, which she had mentioned once in passing. By the 5th Thursday they had talked, in small careful increments, about the weather, about the state of the roads, about the grasshoppers that had been working through the eastern fields. By the 6th he had mentioned Ruth's name once, just in passing, in the context of a story about the summer they had come to Milhaven, and he had said it the way you say a word you have been avoiding for a long time, with a slight catch before it and a slight release after. Nora had not reacted. She had simply listened, and when he was done with the story she had said, "She sounds like she knew her own mind," which was what the story seemed to call for, and he had looked at her with a surprise that said he had been braced for something different. "She sounds like she knew her own mind," he repeated quietly. And there was something in his voice that was not quite a question and not quite an answer. "Yes," Nora said, and let it rest. Outside the porch, the ranch was changing too, slowly, incrementally, with the particular quality of effort that comes not from obligation but from something more personal. The broken rail on the south side of the porch was repaired in the 3rd week. In the 4th, the worst of the weeds along the front path had been cut back. By the 5th, the near pasture fence, the section that ran closest to the house, had new posts in 2 places, bright and raw against the weathered old lumber. He was not restoring the ranch out of duty, Nora thought. He was restoring it for the same reason he put out the water glasses and swept the steps, because Thursday was coming, and there was someone who would see it, and seeing mattered in a way it had not mattered for a long time. She told herself she was here for the same reason she was always here. The tradition, the rotation, the language of covered dishes and quiet company that her community had been speaking for generations. She told herself this on the ride out and on the ride home, and in the kitchen on Wednesday nights when she was packing the basket. She was a careful enough woman to notice that she was having to tell herself more often. It was on a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks into the rhythm, that Agnes Pruitt came to her door. Agnes Pruitt was 55 years old and had been a widow herself for 11 years, and in those 11 years she had occupied a position in Milhaven that was somewhere between pillar and authority. The kind of woman whose approval was sought and whose disapproval was felt without being stated, the way a drop in temperature is felt before the wind actually arrives. She was not unkind. She was not malicious. She was a woman who had built a considerable personal architecture around the concept of what was right and proper, and she maintained it with the focused attention of a woman who understood that such structures, left untended, have a tendency to develop cracks. She had been Ruth Garrett's closest friend. Everyone in Milhaven knew this. She had been the one who sat with Ruth through the worst of the illness, who had made the trips out to the Garrett ranch twice a week in those final months, who had been present at the end. There was a general sense that Agnes Pruitt had a proprietary relationship with Ruth Garrett's memory that was understood if not precisely defined, and that this relationship extended in some unspoken way to include Wade himself, not romantically, or so the town assumed, but in the manner of a guardian. She watched over his well-being and his reputation and his appropriate progress through grief with the focused attention of a woman who had promised something to someone who was no longer there to ask about it. She arrived at Nora's door at 7 in the evening, which was late enough to be intentional. She was dressed neatly, her gray hair precisely pinned, her expression the expression of a woman who had thought carefully about this visit and had decided to approach it with Christian charity whether it deserved it or not. "Nora," she said, "may I come in?" Nora opened the door. They sat at the kitchen table and Nora poured coffee and Agnes arranged herself in the chair with the posture of a woman who was going to say her piece and had decided the kindest way to do it was directly. "I want you to know," Agnes began, "that I have the highest regard for the work, Mrs. Vance and the ladies of the church do. The tradition of caring for those in need is one of the things I value most about this community. Nora waited. Wade Garrett is not like the others on that list, Agnes said.
She said it carefully.
As though placing something fragile on a shelf. He is a man of great private feeling. What happened to him, what he lost, it is not something that casseroles fix. She paused. Ruth was my dearest friend. I was with her at the end. I made her a promise that I would look after him. Nora said nothing. She held her coffee cup and looked at Agnes Pruitt across the table. I only want to make sure, Agnes continued, her voice still careful, still charitable. You understand what you are walking into. A man in that condition, a woman who goes out there week after week. People notice, Nora. People draw conclusions. I would hate for your reputation to suffer on account of a well-meant gesture that perhaps has gone on a bit longer than. Agnes, Nora said quietly. Agnes stopped. I appreciate your concern. I do. Nora's voice was even and gave nothing away. She met Agnes's eyes directly, without aggression, without apology. I am taking a man a hot meal on Thursdays. That is what I am doing. Agnes held her gaze for a moment. There was something moving behind her eyes. Not anger exactly. Something older than anger. Something that had been sitting in her chest for 2 years and had learned to wear very respectable clothes. Of course, Agnes said finally. She stood and smoothed her skirt and picked up her gloves from the table. I only meant to be helpful. I know you did, Nora said. She walked Agnes to the door and watched her go down the path to the road, the older woman's back very straight, her steps very measured, and Nora stood in the doorway for a long time after Agnes had turned the corner and was out of sight. The evening was quiet around her. The sky in the west was the particular deep blue of a Wyoming summer evening, the kind of blue that looks like it goes all the way to the back of the universe. The crickets had started up in the long grass along the fence. In the kitchen behind her, the coffee was still warm. She thought about what Agnes had said, and she thought about what Agnes had not said, and she thought about the 2 cups of water on the table and the swept porch steps, and the jar of dead wildflowers that he had not thrown away. She stood in her doorway in the deepening blue evening and asked herself the question she had been carefully not asking for 6 weeks. She was out there every Thursday 5 miles west, in the chair no one had sat in since Ruth Garrett had last sat in it, bringing food to a man who had refused it from everyone else and was eating everything she brought. She told herself it was the tradition. She told herself it was her turn on the rotation. She told herself it was no different from any of the other names on any of the other lists. But the wildflowers. She had brought the wildflowers twice. No one else on any list had ever gotten wildflowers. She was out there for Wade Garrett. She was fairly sure of that. What she was less sure about was why. Specifically, she was out there for Wade Garrett, and whether the reason she was out there for Wade Garrett was the same as the reason she wanted to be out there for Wade Garrett, and whether those 2 things were the same thing, or whether they were, in fact, entirely different things wearing the same face. She stood in her doorway in the blue Wyoming evening, and she did not have an answer. But inside, the fire was still warm, and the coffee was still hot, and Thursday was coming. She went back inside and did not put the coffee away. The 7th Thursday came with a sky full of high, thin clouds that softened the sun without blocking it, the kind of light that makes the Wyoming grassland look like something a painter would attempt and not quite get right. Nora rode west with a pot of lamb stew on the saddle and a loaf of brown bread wrapped in cloth, and she noticed, as she had begun to notice on these rides, something she could not have named precisely in the first weeks, but that had become unmistakable with time, a steadying in her chest as the road carried her west, as though this direction and this destination had become the compass point her body oriented toward without being asked. Wade was on the porch. He was always on the porch now, and the porch was always swept, and the cups were always waiting, but this Thursday there was something different. On the railing beside the steps, someone had placed a small tin can, and in the can were 3 stems of the yellow clover from the meadow, the same yellow clover she had put in the first jar she had left him 8 weeks ago. He had picked flowers. Nora looked at the can for a moment before she climbed the steps. She did not say anything about it. She sat in her chair and served the food, and he ate with his usual focused quiet, and the afternoon light moved across the porch the way it always did, slow and golden and without any particular urgency. Then he said, "There is a thing I have been wanting to say." She waited. He turned the fork over in his hand, looking at it rather than at her. "About Ruth," he said. "I want to say her name without it being a weight I am dropping on you." He paused. "She was a good woman. The best kind. And I was a good husband to her. I want you to know that. Not because I need you to think well of me, but because it matters that it was real. What we had. It was real, and it was good, and it is over." He looked up then, and his eyes were the clearest she had seen them in all the weeks she had been coming out here. Not healed, but not faded either. Present. "It is over," he said again quietly, like a man testing the structural integrity of a fact he had been afraid to put his full weight on. "And I am still here." Nora looked at him. "I know," she said, and that was all, but it was enough, because what he had said was not a small thing. It was the first time, in all the weeks she had been coming out here, that he had said something that was not about the past or the weather or the practical state of the ranch. It was the first time he had said something about himself, about what was true of him right now, in this present afternoon, on this porch, in this company. She thought about it on the way home. She thought about it in her kitchen that evening and in the field the following morning, and at odd quiet moments throughout the week. The words carried the weight of a decision made, of a man who had been looking at a closed door for 2 years and had finally, carefully, turned the handle. She was still turning it over when the gossip started. It did not arrive all at once. It came the way weather comes in the valley, first as a change in the light, then as a shift in the wind, and then, if you had not paid attention to the earlier signs, as something you were suddenly standing inside of without quite knowing how you got there. The first sign was at the general store on a Monday morning. She had gone in for flour and lamp oil and a paper of pins, and as she came through the door, the conversation between Martha Simmons and the storekeeper's wife, a woman named Nora Callaway, had undergone a particular kind of alteration, not stopping exactly, but rerouting, the way water reroutes around a new obstacle, finding a different channel while the original flow was interrupted. They had greeted her with warmth that was only slightly more careful than usual, and she had taken her purchases and gone home and told herself she was imagining things. The second sign was at the church on Sunday. She had come in and taken her usual seat, and the woman beside her, a neighbor named Clover who had sat beside her at Sunday service for 4 years without incident, had shifted in her pew. Not significantly, an inch, perhaps 2, but enough that Nora felt the geometry of it, the slight recalibration of distance. The third sign was more direct. It came in the form of a conversation she was not part of, overheard in the churchyard on a Wednesday afternoon when she had come to help arrange flowers for the following Sunday's service. 2 women she knew, good women, women she had cooked for and sat with and trusted with small personal things, were talking in the low, serious register that women use when they are discussing something that requires careful handling. She caught only a fragment. Her name and his name adjacent in a sentence, and then the word improper, which landed on her like a stone dropped from a height. She finished arranging the flowers and walked home and stood in her kitchen for a long time. She was angry. This surprised her a little. Not the anger itself, but the clarity of it, the clean, hot edge of it. She was not prone to anger. She was a woman who had built her life on the reliable disciplines of patience and quiet competence, and anger was not a tool that fit easily in that workshop. But she felt it now, a low burning steadiness that was not hot enough to be rage and not cool enough to be resignation. For 9 years she had lived in this town in a way that gave it no cause for anything but respect. She had asked nothing of anyone. She had given what she could when she could, and she had never made a scene, and she had never taken more than her share, and she had never, not once in 9 years, let anyone in Milhaven see her in anything other than a condition of composed, self-sufficient dignity. And now she was improper because she drove a wagon 5 miles west on Thursdays and sat on a porch and fed a man who had not eaten properly in 2 years. They were not seeing a lonely woman sitting with a lonely man. They were seeing a widow behaving in a way that blurred the neat categorical lines that the town had drawn around them both, and the blurring itself was the offense. She went on Thursday anyway. Of course she did. The thought of not going did not genuinely occur to her, which itself told her something she was not quite ready to examine. She went and she sat and they ate, and Wade was a little more talkative than usual. He told her a story about the summer he and Ruth had first come to Wyoming, a long meandering story about a mule who had taken a profound and principled dislike to one particular stretch of road, and he told it with a dry humor that she had not yet seen in him, and it was good, the humor. It was like finding a door in a wall that you had assumed was solid. She laughed. He looked at her when she laughed, with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, something between the two. She noticed on the ride home that he had finished the section of fence along the east boundary of his property, the one that ran parallel to the road. The wire was new, gleaming in the late afternoon light, strung taut between posts that he had set straight and deep. It was good fence work. It was the work of a man who had gotten his hands back. She noticed something else too, something she had not noticed before because she had not been looking at that particular stretch of fence with that particular attention. The east boundary of the Garrett property ran along the ridge above the low crossing on the Milhaven road, and the property on the other side of that ridge, the property that the east fence line bordered, was hers. His fence was being repaired from the south end. He had been working north, toward the road, toward the crossing. He had been working, in other words, toward the boundary with her land. She told herself it meant nothing. A man repairs his fences in order. You start where they need it most and you work your way along. There was nothing significant about the direction. She told herself this with less certainty than she usually brought to self-persuasion, and let the matter rest. The following week, Agnes Pruitt came to the church ladies' meeting. This was not unusual. Agnes came to every meeting, but this time she had arrived with a particular focused energy, the kind that Nora had come to recognize in the weeks since the evening visit, the energy of a woman who has decided to be useful in a specific direction. The meeting was ostensibly about the organization of the summer social, a topic that required perhaps 20 minutes of actual discussion, and typically received 45. Agnes let the social business conclude before she raised what she had actually come to raise. She did it with great delicacy. She did not name Nora directly. She talked about the responsibility the church ladies had to one another and to the community, about the importance of making sure that acts of Christian charity were conducted in a way that protected everyone's dignity, that of the giver and the recipient both. She talked about perceptions and appearances and the way a small community like Milhaven depended on the maintenance of clear and understood social agreements. Several women nodded. Mrs. Vance, at the head of the table, looked at the surface of it very steadily. Nora, who was sitting 3 chairs down from Agnes, said nothing. She listened to every word with the same expression she brought to the rest of the meeting, which was the expression of a woman paying appropriate attention to the proceedings of a body she was part of. She gave Agnes nothing to react to. When the meeting ended, she helped stack the chairs, and she walked home in the warm afternoon, and she was so angry by the time she reached her own gate that she stood in her yard for 5 minutes with her hands in her apron pockets, breathing the way you breathe when you are deciding not to do something impulsive. What Agnes had done was not dramatic. It could not be accused of being dramatic. It was entirely possible that a woman hearing that speech without context would have found nothing in it but a reasonable discussion of community standards. That was, Nora understood, precisely the point. Agnes was too careful and too experienced a practitioner of social pressure to expose herself to the charge of malice. She was simply articulating standards. Standards that happened to be directly and precisely applicable to one specific woman's specific behavior. The town would hear the standards. The town would apply them. Agnes would not have had to say a word that could be repeated back to her with accusation. It was, Nora admitted to herself, rather effective. She went on Thursday. The weeks settled into their rhythm, and the rhythm deepened, and what happened between the visits in the ordinary texture of her daily life was that she thought about the porch more than she thought about anything else. This was the fact she had been trying not to look at directly, and now she was looking at it. She thought about his voice when he was telling the story about the mule, the way the humor had lived in the corners of it. She thought about his hands on the porch railing, the roughness of them, the particular competence that lived in them, the way they had moved when he was talking about the fence work, showing her the dimensions of something without quite meaning to. She thought about the tin can of yellow clover he had put on the railing. She thought about it, and she knew what she was thinking about, and she let herself know it. She had not felt this particular quality of attention in 9 years. She had thought in the first years after Clem that she would feel it again eventually, that it would come back the way spring comes back, as a matter of course, when the conditions were right. And then the years had accumulated, and it had not come back, and she had concluded that this was acceptable, that she had built a life that had enough in it, and that the particular warmth of caring for another person in the specific, irreplaceable way she was thinking about right now was simply not going to be part of her portion. She had made her peace with that conclusion. Apparently the conclusion had not made peace with her. The Saturday before the last Thursday of August, Silas Horn came to church. This was not unusual either. Silas Horn was a regular feature of the Sunday service, a large, deliberate man of 52 who had run the Horn Ranch on the north side of the valley for 20 years and had been a widower for 5 of them. He was well regarded, he was prosperous. He was the kind of man who inspired the word solid, who was described by other men as reliable and by women as a good catch, the latter always with a slight evaluative quality, as though being a good catch were an official designation that had been conferred upon him by some governing body and was now simply a matter of public record. Nora had known Silas Horn for 6 years and had never thought about him as anything other than a neighbor and a fellow congregant. He had a good laugh and a reasonable mind, and he had never, in all the time she had known him, said anything unkind or untrue. These were not small things, but she had also never once, in 6 years of knowing Silas Horn, thought about a tin can of yellow clover. After the service, as the congregation gathered on the church steps in the Sunday warmth, Silas Horn came to stand beside her. He held his hat in his hands. He was wearing his good suit, she noticed, the one he kept for Easter and Christmas and significant occasions. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is now discovering, in the act of delivery, that the rehearsal and the reality are substantially different experiences. "I have a great respect for you, Nora," he said. His voice was steady and the use of her name was deliberate, the careful opening of a man who has thought about this moment for some time. "You are a capable woman, and a good woman, and Milhaven is a better place for having you in it." She kept her expression composed and said, "That is very kind, Silas." A good number of the congregation had not yet dispersed. This was, she understood, not an accident. A woman like you, he continued, should not have to carry the weight of unkind talk. He let that sit for a moment. "You know what I am speaking of, I think." She held his gaze and said nothing. "I have a good ranch," Silas Horn said, and his voice was steady and earnest and not unkind. "A well-run place. I am in a position to offer a comfortable life." He cleared his throat. "I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." The Sunday air was very still. The cottonwoods along the road held their breath. Nora was aware, with a peripheral precision she could not have suppressed if she had tried, of every face turned toward her in the churchyard. She was aware of Agnes Pruitt standing to the left of the church door with the expression of a woman witnessing the tidy conclusion of a matter she had had a hand in arranging. It was not a cruel proposal. There was nothing cruel about Silas Horn. It was a practical proposal, an honest one, offered by a man who meant what he said, and it was framed, she understood, as a rescue. He was offering her a way out of the whispers. He was offering her the return of her respectability, wrapped in the reliable currency of his own reputation and his prosperous ranch and his genuine if unromantic regard for her. She saw all of this clearly. She saw the kindness in it. She saw the trap in it also, not one he had set for her, but one the town had set for both of them, using his honest desire as the mechanism. "Thank you, Silas," she said, and her voice was clear and calm and gave the assembled audience nothing it could clip and save. "That is a generous offer. May I have some time to consider it?" His face relaxed into something that was almost relief. "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need." She thanked him again and made her way to her buggy and drove home, and did not let herself think fully about what had just happened until she was inside her own house with the door closed behind her. Then she sat at her kitchen table and thought about it. She thought about it for 2 days. She went through her chores in her garden and her mending with a surface competence that was indistinguishable from her usual focused quiet, and underneath it she turned the question over and over in her hands like a river stone, feeling the weight and the smoothness and the particular temperature of it. Silas Horne's proposal was a complete thing, a finished thing. He was offering her a life with all its principal elements already in place: a home, a partner, a restoration of standing in the community she had lived in for 11 years. He was offering safety in the deep sense, not merely protection from the gossip, though it would accomplish that, but the more fundamental safety of being inside a recognized social structure, of having a defined and understood place in the architecture of the world. She knew that life. She had lived a version of it with Clem, before the fever, before the 11 days. She knew its textures, she knew its warmth. She also knew, as she turned the stone over for the 100th time, that she could accept Silas Horne's proposal, and it would be the sensible thing. The kind of decision that women with good sense made when they had been alone long enough to understand what alone cost, and she could walk into that finished life and furnish it with her capable hands and her quiet competence, and she would be comfortable, and she would be respected, and she would be, in every way that the town could see and measure, fine. She would also be in the wrong life. This was what she arrived at on the second day, in the mid-morning light of her kitchen. Not a dramatic realization, not a sudden clarity. More like setting down a calculation she had been carrying and finding, when it was finally out of her hands, that the numbers had never quite added up the way she had been telling herself they did. She thought about the porch. She thought about the slow, careful sentences that had been building themselves, week by week, into something that had its own grammar. She thought about the tin can and the swept steps and the moment. This was the moment she had been most carefully not thinking about, when he had said, "I am still here," with the particular weight of a man testing whether the ground would hold. She thought about 9 years of being sensible, 9 years of building and mending and tending and arriving with something warm in her hands for other people's needs. She had never begrudged it. She had meant every pot of soup, every covered dish, every hour spent at someone else's bedside. But she had also, somewhere in those 9 years, stopped expecting that anyone would arrive at her door with something warm for her. The wildflowers were not nothing. She put down the stone. She went out to the barn and saddled her mare. It was a Tuesday. Wade heard the horse before he saw her, which was unusual. He had gotten used in recent weeks to listening for the sound of her approach on Thursdays, to recognizing the particular rhythm of her mare's gait on the road from some distance away. The sound of it on a Tuesday stopped him. He straightened up slowly, the post driver lowering in his hands. He was out in the east pasture, the far section, the fence line that ran along the ridge above the low crossing. He had been working this section for 3 days, and he was close to the northern end now, the end that approached the property line. He had not examined closely why he was working north rather than south. He had simply started where he had started and kept going. He saw her coming through the gate. He watched her cross the yard and come through the near pasture gate and start across the grass toward him, and his chest did something that he had become increasingly aware of in recent weeks, a kind of structural shift, as though something that had been very tight was letting go an increment of tension. He felt it and recognized it, and did not this time immediately try to categorize it as something more manageable than what it was. She stopped at the new fence line. The wire was strung between them, a single bright strand at chest height, new enough to still have its sheen. "Wade," she said. "Nora." He said her name the way you say something you have been saying quietly to yourself, and are now saying out loud for the first time, with a slight difference in resonance. She looked at him across the wire. She looked at the post driver in his hands and the line of new posts running north and south. She looked at his face, which had changed again since the last Thursday, though she could not have said precisely how. It was still the face of a man carrying weight, but the weight was distributed differently now, carried in the manner of a man who has accepted that the weight is his to carry and has stopped waiting for someone to take it from him. "You heard about Silas Horne," she said. It was not a question. He set the post driver against the fence post with a deliberate care that told her something. "Yes," he said. She waited. He looked at the wire between them. He looked at his hands. He said, "He is a good man, steady, prosperous. He can give you the kind of life." "Wade," she said. He stopped. "What are you doing?" She looked at the fence line, the weeks of work evident in the straight new posts, the taut wire running north toward her property line. "Why now?" He was quiet for a moment. "A man cannot let everything fall to ruin," he said finally. His voice was low and had something raw in it that he was not quite concealing. He took a breath. He looked at the wire rather than at her. "There is a part of me that knew what I was doing when I started working north." She stood on her side of the wire and waited. He lifted his eyes to hers, and what was in them was the least guarded thing she had seen from him in all the weeks on the porch. A vulnerability that was the more striking for living in the face of a man who was not, in any other context, unguarded. He was afraid. She could see it plainly. Not of her, but of what he was about to say and what it would mean, and whether she would still be standing there when he was done saying it. "I have been thinking about Thursday on the other days of the week," he said. "That is something I have not done. Not in 2 years. He stopped, started again. I have been living in the same day since Ruth died. The same flat gray day, on a loop. And then you started coming out here and bringing that food and sitting in that chair, and the days started being different from each other again." He looked away toward the horizon, the way he did when something was too direct to hold at close range. He said, "I know I am not offering what Horn is offering. I know this ranch has been a wreck and I have been a worse one. I know I am late." He turned back to her. "But I have been fixing the fences," he said. "I have been fixing the house." He paused. "I would like to keep fixing things. With you here. Not on Thursdays." He held her gaze, and the fear in his eyes had not gone, but it had been joined by something else, something steadier, every day, as my wife. The afternoon was very quiet around them. The wind had dropped. The grass stood still. Above them, the sky was the kind of clear that makes distance feel like a gift. The far hills sharp-edged and certain against the blue. The whole valley spread out below them like something that had been waiting for this particular moment to show itself fully. Nora stood on her side of the bright new wire and felt something she had not felt in 9 years settle into place in her chest like a key finding its lock. Not with drama, not with noise, but with the simple, decisive click of a mechanism operating exactly as it was built to. She said, "It took you long enough, Wade Garrett." The relief on his face was so complete, so unconcealed, that it changed the whole character of his features. He pressed his hand briefly over his eyes and laughed, a short, shaky sound that was not quite steady. "Lord," he said. "I know it. You are here now," she said. "That is the part that counts." He reached out and took hold of the top wire of the fence between them, his large, rough hand closing around it, and she put her hand next to his on the wire, and they stood like that for a moment in the still afternoon, on opposite sides of the line that would not, she was already certain, be a line between them much longer. In the weeks that followed, the town of Milhaven watched what it had spent the summer speculating about become something it had to reckon with instead. Wade came to her house for supper on a Wednesday and was seen arriving and leaving at a proper hour. He walked with her after the Sunday service, his presence at her side quiet and undemonstrative and entirely unambiguous. He did not make speeches. He did not perform courtship for an audience. He simply appeared in the places where she was with a steady and matter-of-fact regularity that communicated everything it needed to communicate without requiring a single explanatory word. The whispers did not stop immediately, but they changed. The tone shifted from the particular frequency of speculation and disapproval to something more complicated. A community working out, in its collective and somewhat laborious way, how to feel about a thing that was happening in front of it and that it had not predicted and could not quite categorize. Agnes Pruitt said nothing. This was noticed. She attended the church ladies' meetings as always, and she participated in the social arrangements, and she sat in her usual pew on Sundays, and when she was in the same space as Nora, she was not unfriendly. She was not warm. She was correct, which was what Agnes Pruitt always was, and what lay underneath the correctness was something that Nora chose not to probe, because she understood that Agnes was managing something private and difficult, and that the management of it was Agnes's business and not hers. Silas Horn, for his part, bore the situation with the dignified equanimity of a man who had made an honest offer and received an honest answer and who had too much genuine good sense to take either personally. He tipped his hat to Nora when they crossed paths, and he shook Wade's hand when they met at the feed store, and the handshake was real, which said something about both of them. It was on the last Thursday of September, the last Thursday before everything was formally settled, that Nora drove west one more time as a single woman on a charitable errand. She brought nothing, no food, no basket, no jar of wildflowers. She arrived at the ranch and tied her horse and climbed the porch steps and sat in the second chair, and Wade came out of the house and sat in the first, and they drank coffee in the particular silence that was theirs, the silence that had built itself up over months of shared company into something that was no longer empty but full. The porch railing was fully repaired now. The path to the door was clear. The paint on the south wall, she saw, had been freshened, not all of it yet, but the worst patches were covered, the gray wounded wood hidden again under white. "You have been busy," she said. "Trying to make it worth something," he said. She looked at the section of fence visible from the porch, the east pasture boundary, the bright new wire running true and straight along the ridge. "You got all the way to the property line," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." She picked up her coffee cup and looked out at the valley in the September light, the grass going gold now, the hills north of town taking on the russet color of fall, and she thought about a line in the ground that had been a boundary becoming a seam instead, two pieces of something joined along a shared edge. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then he said quietly, "I have been thinking about what to do with the meadow on the south end. The soil is good down there. Ruth always wanted to put in an orchard." She looked at him. "An orchard takes years," she said. He looked back at her. "I know," he said simply. She held his gaze, and in it she saw the thing she had been watching come back into him since the first Thursday, the capacity to think past the present day, to imagine a future that had things in it, trees and seasons and years. A man who could plant an orchard was a man who had decided to stay in the world. She said apple or pear. He considered this with genuine seriousness, which she had come to understand was how he approached all questions, even small ones. "Both," he said finally. "And maybe some cherry along the north end of the meadow." She nodded, as though they were discussing something already decided, because they were. The afternoon light was long and warm on the porch, and the valley below was going slowly gold, and the coffee in her cup was the right temperature, and the second chair held her the way a good chair holds a person who has sat in it enough times that the wood has learned the shape of them. Thursday, she thought, had always been the right day. She was already looking forward to when it would be every day instead. The morning Nora rode out to the Garrett ranch on a Tuesday was the morning she stopped waiting for permission. She had spent 2 days inside the question that Silas Horne's proposal had placed in front of her, turning it over with the same careful attention she brought to everything. And what she had found at the center of it, when she finally stopped turning and simply looked, was not an answer so much as a recognition. The answer had been there for weeks. It had been there in the way she packed the basket on Wednesday nights, in the way her hands reached for the wildflowers without being told, in the way Thursday had become the fixed point around which the rest of her week arranged itself. She had simply been too careful, too accustomed to the discipline of not wanting things she was not sure she was allowed to want, to look at it directly. She was done being that careful. She saddled her mare in the gray early morning and rode west, and the road unreeled in front of her through the pale gold light of a Wyoming autumn morning, the hills to the north carrying the first real color of the season, the cottonwoods along the creek going yellow at their tops. The air had that particular quality it gets in late September, clean and thin and carrying the smell of dry grass and coming cold, the smell of a season preparing to change its character entirely. She did not rehearse what she was going to say. She had learned in 9 years of showing up at difficult doors that rehearsal was the enemy of the real. You planned what you were going to say, and the plan became the thing you were protecting instead of the person you were there for. She had learned to arrive with open hands, with whatever she actually had, and let that be enough. What she actually had this Tuesday morning was herself. That would have to do. Wade was in the east pasture when she arrived, just as she had known, in the particular way she had come to know things about him, that he would be. She could hear the sound of work before she could see him over the rise, the clean, rhythmic strike of a post driver, a sound that carried in the still morning air with the clarity of a bell. She tied her horse at the gate and walked up through the near pasture on foot, the dry grass crunching under her boots, and came over the low rise to see him at the far end of the fence line. He was driving the last post in the northern section. She could see it. The work was nearly complete, the bright wire running all the way to where the Garrett property met her own land along the ridge. The two properties separated now by a fence line so new it still gleamed, each post set plumb and true. He had done it. He had worked his way north all the way to the boundary, one post at a time, over the weeks, and now there was one post left to drive and he was driving it. She stopped at a distance and watched him work. He had his sleeves rolled to the elbows and his hat pushed back on his head, and he was driving the post with the steady, full-weight rhythm of a man who knew how to use his body efficiently, who had been doing physical work long enough that effort and economy had become the same motion. Each strike was clean and level. The post was going in straight. She watched him drive it down to the right depth, test it with both hands, find it sound, and set the driver down. He straightened up and turned, and he saw her. He stood very still for a moment. His eyes went to the sun, instinctively calculating the hour, and she saw the slight displacement on his face that comes from finding something in the wrong place at the wrong time. Not unwelcome, but disorienting in the way that good surprises are always slightly disorienting. She walked toward him through the grass. She stopped at the fence line on her side of the wire, and they stood with the new bright strand between them, and she looked at him across it, at his face in the morning light with the sweat on it, and the honest tiredness of physical work and the guarded, careful expression that he wore now, which was different from the expression he had worn in the early weeks. In the early weeks, his face had been closed because he had nothing he was willing to offer. Now it was guarded because he had something he was afraid to lose. "You heard about Silas Horne's offer," he said. His voice was careful, leveled down, the voice of a man managing his register. She said, "I know you did." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him decide to say the thing he had clearly been arranging since the moment he had heard the news. "He is a good man," Wade said. steady. His place is in order. He can offer you standing in this town, a comfortable life. He looked down at the wire between them, everything a woman in your position would have reason to want. She waited. She let him finish making the case he did not want to make. He looked back up. His eyes were doing the thing they did when he was choosing honesty over safety. The slight narrowing, the direct hold. I know what I have to offer is not the same thing, he said. A ranch that has been half a ruin. 2 years of. He stopped. A man who has been gone from himself for longer than he ought to have been. Wade, she said. He stopped. Why, she said. Did you work this fence line north? He looked at the wire. He looked at the final post, fresh and raw and plumb at the edge of her property. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that is not absence of thought, but the opposite of it. Because I wanted to be working towards something, he said finally. His voice was low and had a rawness in it that was not quite under control. He looked at her. I know what is on the other side of this line. She held his gaze. I have been walking around the thing I want to say for 6 weeks, he said. Maybe longer. He put his hand on the top wire of the fence, his palm flat against it, and she could see the effort in his jaw. The effort of a man who has spent 2 years not saying things, finally deciding to say one. I do not want to just wait for Thursday, Nora. He lifted his eyes to hers, and they were clear and afraid and entirely present. I want you here every day. I want to sit on that porch with you in the mornings and come in at the end of the day and find you in the kitchen and plan the orchard with you and fix whatever is broken next together. He took a breath. I want you to be my wife. The morning was very still around them. The wind had dropped. The grass stood still. The sky above stretched clear and deep in every direction, and the whole of the valley below them was laid out in the September light, patient and unhurried and exactly as it had always been. Nora stood on her side of the bright new wire and felt something she had not felt in 9 years settle into place in her chest like a key finding its lock. Not with drama, not with noise, but with the simple decisive click of a mechanism operating exactly as it was built to. She said, "It took you long enough, Wade Garrett." The relief on his face was extraordinary. It moved across his features like light moves across a landscape when the clouds break, not all at once, but progressively, illuminating things that had been in shadow. He pressed his hand briefly over his eyes and laughed, the shaky, real laugh of a man who has been very afraid and is now suddenly not. She stepped through the fence line. She did it practically, lifting the lower wire and ducking through the way she would have ducked through any fence on any morning. And she came up on his side of it and stood in front of him, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been given something he did not entirely believe was going to be given, and is still in the early moments of understanding that it is real. She reached out and took his hand, the rough, calloused one that had been driving fence posts since dawn, and held it between both of hers. You got here, she said. That is the part that matters. He turned his hand and held hers, and they stood on his side of the fence line in the morning light, and the valley spread below them in the clean September air, and above them the sky was open in every direction, unobstructed and full of light. They told no one that day. There was no announcement, no formal declaration. What happened instead was what had always happened between them, the quiet accumulation of visible things. He appeared at her house for supper that Wednesday, as he had been doing. He walked beside her out of the church service that Sunday. He helped her restake the east end of her garden fence the following Saturday without being asked because it needed doing, and he was there, and that was simply how things were now. Milhaven watched this with the focused collective attention it brought to anything it needed to form an opinion about. It was Mrs. Vance who came to see Nora first. She arrived on a Monday afternoon with a plate of sand cookies, which was her way of indicating that she was making a pastoral call of a personal rather than official nature. They sat at Nora's kitchen table, and Mrs. Vance said, in her straightforward way, that she thought it was a fine thing, that she had thought so for some time, and that she hoped Nora was happy. Nora said that she was. Mrs. Vance ate a cookie and said that she had always thought the tradition was a remarkable thing. What it could do, what it could open up, how it put people in each other's company in the right moments. She said it with the slight air of a woman crediting a mechanism she had a hand in setting in motion without quite claiming credit for it. Nora looked at her across the table. You put his name at the bottom of the list, Nora said. Mrs. Vance arranged another cookie on the plate. The pastor felt it was time to try again, she said, which was exactly what she had said in the church office in June, and her expression was precisely neutral. Nora let it rest. What did not rest was Agnes Pruitt. Agnes had maintained her correctness through the weeks following the fence line conversation, had continued to attend every meeting and occupy every social occasion with her usual formidable propriety, had continued to treat Nora with a courtesy that was impeccable in every technical sense. But Nora was a woman who paid attention, and what she had been paying attention to in Agnes was the quality of the effort behind the courtesy. It was costing Agnes something. The correctness was not coming from the same place it usually came from, which was a settled internal conviction about how things ought to be. It was coming from a decision, made and renewed each day, to behave well in a situation that Agnes Pruitt found privately devastating. Nora understood this because she was a woman who had spent 9 years learning how to read the grammar of what people did not say, and what Agnes was not saying was something that had no comfortable shape. She had loved Ruth Garrett. She had been faithful to Ruth's memory, in the way that women who have lost their dearest friends sometimes consecrate themselves to the preservation of everything that friend had been and had. And part of what Ruth had been in Agnes's understanding of things was Wade's wife, and the space that Ruth had occupied was a space that Agnes had, in her private, carefully unexpressed interior, understood to be indelibly Ruth's. Nora's presence in it was not simply a social impropriety. It was an erasure of something Agnes had been guarding. None of this had ever been said. Nora was not certain Agnes had ever said it to herself. It was on the Saturday 2 weeks before the wedding that Agnes came to the Garrett ranch. Nora was there. She had been there since morning, helping to finish the whitewashing of the south wall of the house, a task that had been on the list for weeks, and that she had taken up with the focused, practical energy she brought to all physical work. She was on the porch with a brush and a bucket when she heard the horse on the road, and she looked up and saw Agnes Pruitt riding in through the gate on her gray mare, her back straight as a fence post and her expression the expression of a woman on a mission that she had decided to complete regardless of the personal cost. Wade was in the barn. He came out when he heard the horse, the way men who live alone learn to register the sound of approach, and he stood in the barn doorway with a rag in his hands and watched Agnes ride in. Agnes dismounted and tied her horse with the precise, composed movements she brought to everything, and then she stood in the yard and looked at the house. She looked at the whitewashed wall. She looked at the mended porch railing, the cleared path, the new wood on the steps. She stood there for a long moment looking at all of it, and something moved through her face that was not quite expressible. A private accounting, a woman totaling up what had changed and what the changing meant. Then she looked at Nora on the porch. Nora set down her brush. The three of them were quiet for a moment in the Saturday morning, the yard between them holding a particular quality of suspended significance, the kind that precedes things that need to be said and have been waiting a long time for their moment. "Agnes," Wade said. His voice was even. He walked out of the barn doorway and into the yard, the rag still in his hands. Agnes looked at him. Her face up close was the face of a woman who had decided to be honest and was finding that honesty, when you have postponed it long enough, has a physical quality, a weight in the chest and a tightness in the throat. She said, "I promised Ruth I would look after you." Wade nodded. He held her gaze with a gentleness that Nora had seen directed at her on the porch in the good hours, the particular gentleness of a man who has come back from somewhere very far away and has developed, in the process, a genuine tenderness for the fragility of things. He said, "I know you did, Agnes, and you kept that promise. You were here when nobody else knew how to be." Agnes's jaw tightened slightly. "I do not know what Ruth would say about all this," she said. Her voice was low and had a tremor in it that she was controlling with considerable effort. Wade was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ground, then back up. He said, "I know what she would say." He said it simply, without performance, with the authority of a man who had known his wife for 8 years, and had spent 2 years in conversation with her memory. She would say, "I stayed in that house in the dark long enough." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was quieter but entirely steady. "She did not think much of giving up, Agnes. You know that as well as I do, and she would not have wanted this for me." The words landed in the yard between them and settled there, and Agnes looked at him for a long time. The tremor in her jaw was more visible now. She was fighting something, and she was not quite winning, and for the first time since Nora had known her, she looked not like a woman of formidable purpose, but simply like a woman who was tired and had been carrying something heavy for a long time. Then she looked at Nora. The look was direct and complicated and had several things in it at once. There was an assessment in it, the kind that women give each other when they are trying to determine something important. There was a grief in it that had nothing to do with hostility. And there was something that surprised Nora, something that surfaced in the last moment before Agnes looked away, that was almost, not quite but almost, a form of recognition. One woman who had organized her life around the care of others, looking at another woman who had done the same thing. Agnes walked to the porch steps. She stood at the bottom of them and she looked up at Nora and she said very quietly, so that only the two of them could hear it at that particular distance, "You sat in Ruth's chair." Nora met her eyes. Agnes held her gaze for one more moment. Then she said, "I hope you are worth it." It was not a curse. Nora had been prepared in the back of her mind for something that felt like a curse, and this was not that. It was an inheritance. It was the only form of blessing that Agnes Pruitt had in her at this moment, stripped down to its barest bones, and she was giving it in the only way she knew how to give it, which was with her standards still attached, with the condition explicit, because Agnes was not capable of unconditional, and perhaps had never been, and that was simply the shape of her. Nora said, "I intend to be." Agnes looked at her for one moment longer. Then she turned with the same composed precision with which she had arrived, untied her horse and mounted up. She rode out through the gate without looking back, her back straight, her gray mare moving at an even trot. Nora stood on the porch and watched her go until the road bent, and Agnes was out of sight. Then she stood a moment more in the October morning, the whitewash brush in her hand, the smell of fresh paint and cold air around her. Wade came up the porch steps and stood beside her. "She all right?" Nora asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the road. "She loved Ruth," he said. The way that some people only get to love one person that well, and after that person is gone, they do not know what to do with all of it. He paused. She will be all right. Nora thought about what it was to have all that love and no longer have the person it was built around. She thought about 9 years of knowing that particular longitude and what it cost and what it could cost you if you were not careful. She picked up her brush. I am going to finish the south wall, she said. He looked at the wall, the bright white of the fresh paint against the clear October sky. Then he went and got the second brush. They worked side by side through the rest of the morning, the sound of the brushes steady and unhurried against the old wood, the smell of fresh paint mixing with the cold autumn air. They did not talk much. They did not need to. The work itself was a kind of conversation, two people moving through the same space with the same purpose, each aware of the other without having to announce it. By midday, the south wall was done. They married on the 14th of October, 1883, on a Saturday that arrived with a sky so blue it looked deliberate, the kind of blue that the Wyoming autumn produces in its finest weeks, hard and clear and going all the way down to the foundations of everything. The cottonwoods along the Milhaven road had gone full gold. The hills to the north were russet and copper, and the occasional dark green of the pines, and the whole valley looked like something assembled specifically for the occasion. The church was full. This surprised Nora slightly, though it should not have. Milhaven was a small town, and small towns did not miss weddings, which were, along with funerals, the primary occasions on which the community confirmed its own existence to itself. But there was a quality to the fullness of the church that went beyond ordinary attendance. People had come with a particular attentiveness. They had come, she thought, because they had watched the whole of it. The Thursday rides, the gossip, the proposal on the church steps, the slow and visible restoration of a man and a ranch and something harder to name, and they understood that they were present at the conclusion of something that had been, in its quiet way, a story worth witnessing. She stood in the vestibule in her good dress, the blue wool she had made 2 falls ago and worn only twice, and she thought about the first Thursday. She thought about the peeling paint and the drooping railing and the man in the chair who had been so far inside his grief he barely registered her arrival. She thought about the chair he had pulled out without meaning to, the reflex of courtesy that had survived everything else. She thought about the wildflowers and the swept steps and the fence that had worked its way north 1 post at a time. She thought about Ruth because it was right to think about Ruth, because Ruth was part of the story and not the part that ended before it began. Ruth had been real, and her life had been real, and her death had been real. And the love that had existed between her and the man waiting at the front of the church was real. And Nora walked toward that reality with open eyes and without apology. She was not replacing Ruth. She was not erasing her. She was sitting in the chair that had been empty, and the chair being empty was not where the story ended. The pastor's words were simple and short, because both she and Wade had asked him, separately and without coordinating it, for simple and short, and this small evidence of their already existing alignment had pleased her when she learned of it. Wade stood beside her at the front of the church and held her hand with the particular solidity of a man who has decided where he is standing and is not moving. And he looked at her the way she had not been looked at in a very long time, with a full and steady attention that did not flinch and did not perform, and was simply, entirely there. She held his hand and said the words and meant them with the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent 11 years learning to mean what she said. When it was done, the town came forward. There was food, because there was always food in Milhaven at the important occasions, and the women of the church had produced a spread that represented their finest collective effort, the kind of table that gets assembled when a community wants to say something it does not have words for, and knows how to say it this way instead. Mrs. Vance had made her apple cake. Bess Culver had brought a glazed ham. The table was full, and the church hall was warm, and the voices of the town filled the space in the way that voices do when everyone present is. However they had arrived at this moment, glad to be in the same room. Agnes Pruitt was there. She came in after the ceremony had concluded, and she took a chair near the back of the hall rather than at one of the main tables, and she had a plate of food and a cup of coffee, and she was not unfriendly, and she was not warm, and she was there, which was the thing that mattered. She stayed for an hour. When she left, she said goodbye to Mrs. Vance and nodded to Nora across the room, a nod that was small and composed and had something in it that was neither approval nor disapproval, but something past both of those, something that was simply acknowledgement. Nora nodded back. Silas Horn was also there. He shook Wade's hand with a genuine warmth and told Nora she looked well, which was the kind of simple, honest thing Silas Horn always said, and she liked him for it, had always liked him for it, and she was glad he was there. She and Wade drove home to the ranch in the October afternoon, the gold light long across the valley, the hills casting shadows that moved slowly as the sun descended. The wagon moved at the easy pace of a horse that knows the road, and they rode side by side in the particular silence that was theirs, the one that had been built over months of shared company and was now large enough to hold everything. He put his hand over hers on the seat between them. She turned her hand and held his. The ranch, when they came up the road and through the gate, looked like itself again. More than itself, perhaps, which is what a place looks like when it has been cared for and is cared for still. The porch was sound. The paint was fresh on the south wall. The path was clear. In the fading light, the house had the particular warmth of a structure that had been returned to its purpose, a place where people live and tend and stay. The 2 chairs were on the porch. They had always been 2 chairs, even in the worst of it, even when only one was used, as though the ranch itself had not been willing to give up the possibility of the second one being occupied. They sat down in them as the last light left the valley. He brought out coffee. She told him she preferred tea. He said he knew and had made tea also, and produced a second cup from somewhere, and she looked at him with the expression this deserved. He smiled. The smile reached his eyes before it reached his mouth, the way she had first heard it described and had eventually seen it for herself. The smile of a man who was not performing happiness but simply feeling it. They sat in the cooling October evening and drank their respective cups and watched the sky go from blue to rose to the deep, certain dark of a Wyoming night, the stars arriving one by one as they always did, without announcement, simply appearing when the conditions were right. 5 years is a long time, and not long at all, and both of these things were true in 1888 in the way that all true things about time eventually revealed themselves to be double. The porch was the same porch. The 2 chairs were the same 2 chairs, their wood worn smooth now with the specific polish of long use, the kind of smoothness that only comes from the same bodies returning to the same place, over and over, day after day, until the wood remembers the particular weight of the people it holds. The railing was sound, the path was clear, the house behind them was bright with lamplight, and the smell of supper and something else, the smell of a place fully inhabited, of a life being actually lived inside it rather than survived. From inside the house came a sound that had not been part of the porch's history in its previous years, a sound that was now so central to the texture of an evening at the Garrett ranch that the absence of it would have felt like a missing piece of the air. It was a shriek of laughter, small and high and entirely committed, followed by the rapid patter of short legs on wooden floors and a second voice, lower, more aggrieved, calling out with the particular outrage of a 6-year-old who has been wronged in a way that is both serious and incomprehensible. He took my doll. The screen door opened and shut with its characteristic slap, and a 4-year-old boy appeared on the porch, moving at the full speed available to a 4-year-old boy, which is considerable. He had his father's light eyes and a tuft of blonde hair at the front that refused, regardless of water or combing, to lie flat. In one hand, held aloft with the gravity of a trophy, was a corn husk doll. Behind him came his sister. Eleanor Garrett was 6 years old and had her mother's hands and her mother's eyes and her mother's exact expression of calm, determined capability, which on a 6-year-old face had the quality of something that would in time be formidable. She planted herself in the doorway with her hands on her hips and made her case. "He took it from my room," she said. "I was keeping it there." The boy, whose name was Colt, held the doll slightly higher. "Colt," Wade said. His voice was low and entirely unhurried, the voice of a man who had discovered that this particular register was the most effective one available for small children and large cattle alike. "Give your sister her doll." Colt looked at the doll. He looked at his father. He carried out the brief internal negotiation available to 4-year-olds between what they want and what will happen if they continue to want it. He handed the doll to Eleanor with the expression of a man conceding a point he still privately holds. "Eleanor," Nora said. "Come sit." Eleanor came and settled against her mother's side with the natural ease of a child who has been doing this since before she could walk, leaning in with her full weight, tucking her head against Nora's arm. She held her doll in her lap and looked out at the valley with the interested, evaluating expression she brought to most things. Colt had climbed into his father's lap in the wordless way that small children claim the places that belong to them, simply occupying the space as though it had been built for the purpose. Wade's arm went around him with the same instinctive ease, and the boy settled against his chest and was immediately still, with the speed that very young children go from full motion to complete rest. The 4 of them sat on the porch in the October evening of 1888, and the valley spread out below them in the last light. The hills to the north in their autumn color, the fields of the ranch in the particular golden gone to seed of the end of the growing season, the fence lines running straight and clean all the way to the far boundaries, the ones that joined now rather than divided. The orchard was visible from the porch if you knew where to look. 3 years in, the apple trees on the south end of the meadow were still young, still in their first real growth, but they had survived 2 winters and were coming on well. The pear trees were a little further along, the ones nearest the creek. The cherry trees along the north edge, the ones Wade had proposed on the day that the fence wire still ran between them like a question waiting to be answered, were the most recent, planted only last spring, just sticks in the ground still but present and accounted for. "An orchard takes years," she had said. "I know," he had said, simply, as though that were the whole point. She looked at the young trees in the fading light and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing begun in faith and proceeding according to its own patient calendar. Eleanor, who had been quiet for several minutes in the focused way she had when she was thinking through something important, said, "Mama." "Yes," Nora said. "Why do we have 2 chairs out here?" Eleanor said. There was genuine inquiry in it. There were 4 of them, after all, and sometimes they had visitors, and the porch held only the 2. Nora looked at the chairs. She looked at Wade over Eleanor's head, and he was looking at her with the smile that started in his eyes. She said, "We started with 2 chairs, one for your father and one for me, before you and Colt came along." Eleanor considered this. "Were you married yet?" "Not yet," Nora said. "Then why were you sitting on his porch?" A 6-year-old's sense of how things ought to be arranged was, it turned out, not entirely different from the town's. Nora found she was smiling. "She brought him supper," she said. "Because he needed it." Eleanor thought about this with the serious evaluative attention she brought to everything. "Was he sick?" Wade said. "I was a little," in a different way. Eleanor looked at her father. "You look fine now." "That is because your mother kept coming back," Wade said. His voice was easy and certain and had nothing complicated in it. "She came back every week until I was better." He looked at Nora. "Some things take time." Eleanor accepted this with the practical flexibility of a child who has not yet decided that all explanations need to be entirely logical. She looked out at the valley. She said, "I would have come back too." Nora held her daughter a little closer. Colt had fallen asleep, the specific profound unconsciousness of small children who are done with the day, his head tipped back against his father's chest, the contested doll now apparently forgotten by all parties. Wade held him with the easy competence of a man who had learned this particular skill in the last few years and had found it to be among the most important ones he possessed. The last light left the valley. The stars were coming one by one out of the deep blue above the eastern hills. Wade reached over with his free hand, the one not holding his sleeping son, and found Nora's hand resting on the arm of her chair. He covered it with his. She turned her hand and laced her fingers through his, the way she had on the fence line on a Tuesday morning 5 years ago, and they sat like that in the cooling evening with their children and their orchard and their sound fences and their particular, hard-won quiet. Beside her, Eleanor had also fallen asleep, her head heavy against Nora's arm, the corn-husk doll held loosely in her small, capable hands. Nora looked down at her daughter's face, composed and still in sleep, and felt the weight and the warmth of her, and it was a good weight, the best kind. Wade was looking at her. She could feel it before she turned to confirm it, the way she had been able to feel it since the very first Thursday, the specific quality of his attention, which had always been the most fully present attention she had ever been the recipient of. She turned and looked at him across their sleeping children. He said quietly, so as not to wake them, "Took me long enough." It was what she had said to him on the fence line on the Tuesday morning when she had stopped waiting for permission. He had been saying it back to her in various ways ever since. "You got there," she said. On the porch railing, in a small mason jar that Eleanor had placed there that afternoon because she liked the way things looked when you put them in a jar, there were 3 stems of yellow clover from the south meadow. Nora looked at the jar. She thought about the first one she had left on this table 5 years ago, without quite knowing why, without examining the impulse closely enough to stop it. She thought about coming back the following Thursday to find it still there, the flowers dry and transparent, and the second chair swept clean and the 2 cups of water waiting on the table between them. She thought about a door that is not closed but merely very heavy, and what happens when someone with patient hands keeps pushing. She thought about the chair he had pulled out without meaning to, the reflex of a good man reaching for hospitality even when hospitality was the last thing he thought he had left, and how much is preserved in a reflex, how much of a person survives in the things they do without thinking. She thought about how a tradition moves, how it passes from hand to hand without ceremony, without instruction, how it carries inside it, without anyone having to say so, the knowledge that the point is not the food, the point is the showing up. The point is the returning, week after week, to the place where someone is struggling to find their way back, and simply being present there, and trusting that presence to be enough, and being right about that. The Garrett ranch stretched out below them in the dark, its fields productive, its pastures sound, its house lit from within. The fence lines ran straight in every direction, and where the eastern line met the boundary of Nora's old property, there was no boundary anymore. There was simply land, their land continuous and whole, running without interruption from one end of their life to the other. The stars had fully arrived now, the Wyoming sky doing what it does in the clear nights of October, which is to produce more stars than the human mind is entirely prepared for, a depth and density of light that makes the darkness around it feel not empty but full of distance and time, and the particular silence of things that have been burning steadily for longer than anyone has been there to notice. The porch held them, all 4 of them, in the old chairs that had been there since before any of this and would be there after. Wade said nothing more. Nora said nothing more. The children slept. The clover moved once in the evening breeze and was still, and that was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Love was not always a lightning strike, Nora thought. She had believed that once, when she was young and did not yet understand what endurance asked of a person. She had believed that the large feelings came all at once, that they announced themselves with heat and noise and the certainty of something irreversible. She had waited after Clem for that kind of feeling to come back to her, the way you wait for a train you once rode to return to the same station. But that was not how it had come. It had come the way the tradition came, without announcement, without instruction, simply understood. It had come in the sweep of a porch step and the weight of 2 tin cups filled with water. It had come in 4 sentences about the state of a road and the need for rain. It had come in the slow northward progress of a fence line, working its way towards something the man who was building it was not yet ready to name. It had come because she had shown up, because she had gone back, because she had sat in a chair that had been empty and trusted that this sitting itself was enough, and she had been right about that. The yellow clover stood in its jar on the railing, and the stars burned in the October sky, and the children slept in the arms of the people who would keep them, and the ranch below was whole, and the valley was quiet, and the 2 chairs on the porch held them the way. Good chairs hold the people who have chosen them. Without effort, without ceremony, with the particular and reliable warmth of something that has been used exactly as it was meant to be used, for exactly as long as it was meant to last.